All right, it only took like 10 weeks into the season. Chris, I think I got it figured out. I think I got the rules as far as picking the right booms, or at least avoiding the wrong ones.
All right, let's hear it.
No tight ends, no Jets, nobody who has to try to catch passes from Bo Nix. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, no DK Metcalf.
All right, we're going to try to get him all right this week for sure. Feel good about these players. You should too. Here we go. These are the booms for week 11. First, real quick, always the right pick. Click that subscribe button. Look, I know most of you already have done it. If you're new here, if you haven't done it for some reason, help us out. Click subscribe. We're almost there. Getting to 100K. We want to do it before the season is over. All right, now first off, kind of excited to get to talk about a player we basically never get to discuss on this video, because we really never have to talk about Justin Jefferson at all, do we? He's a must start. You set and you forget. I mean, what is there to question? There's a lot to question these days because Justin Jefferson has not been a monster at all. In fact, a lot of people are straight up panicking. Chris, obviously you broke this down on the panic video, but look, I mean, he hasn't had a 100-yard game since week 5. He only has 2 touchdowns all season long. And I mean, look, the elephant in the room, his name is JJ McCarthy. All right. So JJ McCarthy has not been good for Justin Jefferson, right? This JJ to JJ connection, not feeling it. In fact, when McCarthy has been in for the 4 games that he has started, 12.5 PPR points per game. That's what Justin Jefferson has given you. And as we've seen the last 2 weeks since McCarthy came back from injury, a total of 84 yards in 2 games for Justin Jefferson, who is supposed to be the best receiver in all of football. It's not that he's not getting targeted. He's getting targeted plenty. He's not catching the targets because they're not catchable. Over those 4 games when McCarthy has been in there, Justin Jefferson has a 50% catch rate. It's not the hands. I guarantee you, it's not Jefferson. So, I mean, why would this get better? Do we have to question him starting against the Bears this week? Because look, McCarthy was a quarterback when they played in week 1, and Justin Jefferson only had 44 yards on 4 catches in that game. So, like, why do we have to start him this week?
Well, this is a totally different Bears defense than the one we saw in week 1, specifically the secondary. Jalen Johnson, their stud corner, he's out. Kyler Gordon, their second best corner, he's also out. Their next best corner, Tyreek Stevenson, he ranks 90th among 112 qualified cornerbacks in coverage grade, according to Pro Football Focus. Last week, he was targeted 8 times against the Giants. He allowed 6 catches for 96 yards. I don't think he has a chance against Justin Jefferson this week. Not to mention the Bears are allowing the 5th most points to wide receivers. But what I really like about this spot is this feels like a spot where everything that didn't happen last week for Justin Jefferson will happen this week. Kind of feels similar to Rome Odunze for me. Remember, 2 weeks ago, he's coming off the 0, a lot of missed connections. And then last week, we were like, no, he's going to boom. He's going to have a big game. And he did. I think that's what we're going to see from Jefferson this week. Because not only are the Bears terrible against wide receivers, they're only second behind the Cowboys in terms of receptions, yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points allowed to wide receivers on throws of 20 or more yards. Last week, Justin Jefferson had the second most throws or targets of over 20 yards. Yet among the top 10 in targets of over 20 yards, he was the only one that didn't catch a single one of those. Because like you said, JJ McCarthy was just off so bad last week. But against this secondary in this spot, it feels like the perfect spot for those long throws, those end zone connections to actually connect this week, where JJ McCarthy will have more time and Justin Jefferson will be wide open all over the field. And you know what? Let's keep a streak going here. We got a streak going right now. 3 straight weeks we have said, take somebody's line, hire their touchdown line on Underdog on this video, and it's hit. 3 weeks ago, we said Henry, he scored. 2 weeks ago, we said Kyron, he scored. Last week, we said Rico, he scored. I'm betting on it. I'm saying Justin Jefferson's finding the end zone this week against his Bears secondary. He's going to score this week. Look, you pair that with the new customer pick you're going to get. That's Jahmyr Gibbs doing literally anything, and that's a win right there. Plus, when you play your first $5, Underdog is going to give you $100 in bonus cash, win or lose. And of course, when you join and use promo code ENDGAME, they're going to match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000.
Now, another receiver, you really didn't think you'd have to struggle each week with, do I start T. Higgins or do I not? Well, I mean, obviously things went south in a hurry for the Bengals, off to a slow start, and then Joe Burrow has been out. But this offense has been redeemed by Joe Flacco. And so in the 4 games since Flacco has been in at quarterback here, T. Higgins has seen 8, 10, 9 targets in a game. Just that one blip on the radar was the Jets game where for some reason he only got 2. And in those 3 games where he was targeted heavily, he had 5, 6, and 7 receptions. Okay, and the other thing is he is getting those end zone targets. In fact, scoring more than Chase these days. He has 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games combined. And so T. Higgins is not only thriving, right? He hasn't gone under double-digit points with Joe Flacco there, because even in that Jets game where he only had 1 catch, it was a touchdown, right? Decent-sized touchdown. So he's not letting you down, but this is one of those games where you basically have to start him because, yeah, one of those really good games he had with Flacco that I just mentioned, it's against the same team this week. It's the Steelers.
Yeah, and that game was an absolute shootout, if you remember. And I'm sure it'll be a shootout again. Yeah, in that game, he had 6 catches, 96 yards, and a touchdown. And I do recall we put him on the booms that week again because of the matchup. So let's just go back to the well and put him on the booms again this week. Steelers play the 5th most man defense 40% of the time. He actually has the same targets per route run as Jamar Chase against man, but he has a higher yards per route run and fantasy points per route run than Chase against man. Plus, the Steelers play the 3rd most single high 62% of the time. Again, he doesn't have higher target per route run or yards per route run, but he does have a higher fantasy points per route run than Chase against single high. Now, I'm not saying T. Higgins is going to outscore Jamar Chase, or if you have both of them, you should sit Jamar Chase for T. Higgins. No, you're starting Jamar Chase no matter what. But these coverage shells are the coverage shells T. Higgins absolutely dominates. You look at it on the season against man and single high, 0.27 and 0.24 targets per route run, 2.31 and 2.12 yards per route run, and a 0.63 and a 0.58 fantasy points per run. Now you look at it against zone and 2 high, only a 0.13 and a 0.14 targets per route run, only a 1.27 and a 1.24 yards per route run, and only 0.27 and 0.26 fantasy points per route run. The reason we liked him in that first matchup, because he dominates the Steelers coverage shell. The reason why we like him again this week, because he still dominates the Steelers coverage shell, and he's got slinging Joe Flacco back there just slinging it. The Bengals just chuck it with Flacco. T. Higgins probably going to boom again this week.
Now with Joe Flacco slinging it, as you mentioned, and a lot of passing going on that first matchup, these teams meet again, you might wonder, okay, so where does that leave Chase Brown? I mean, is he going to take a backseat to the passing game here? You know, is he a guy I really can trust for sure that I want to start? You know, does he have high enough ceiling here in this offense? Well, you might be surprised to find that the answer is we like him a lot because he's on the Booms video. You've got to start Chase Brown this week, and we'll tell you why. Like, before we get to the matchup part, let's also talk about what has happened these last couple of weeks since not just Flacco has been in there, but let's face it, since Jake Browning has been out. In fact, the first 5 games, he didn't even reach 4 yards per carry. He didn't go over that mark. And that's just kind of like your baseline for a good running back. So if you can't go over 4 yards per carry, wasn't putting up a big yardage, wasn't like scoring a ton. And again, we were panicked about this entire offense, but especially with Chase Brown. And then lately, what have we seen? Again, like Higgins, we have flipped the script here. In fact, the last game before their bye, that was the first time Chase Brown had gone under 4 yards per carry. In that span, he's averaged over 6 yards per carry. That's 4th best among all running backs. And in that one game where he didn't run as well, he made up for it with 8 catches for 75 yards. So Chase Brown is now verified as a bell cow again. He's getting all the touches, not only as, the runner here, but as a receiver, as you've seen. I mean, they got nothing else. Samaje Perine missed last week. He's got a high ankle sprain. Very much in doubt whether he'll play this week. I mean, they just don't have a lot of depth behind him. It's all Chase Brown. In fact, all season, he's really been a bell cow. He's been 7th among all running backs in rush share for the team. He's also 7th among all running backs in expected fantasy points. I mean, you need that in your lineup because he's always got the potential there to have a big game. And I guarantee you that this is one of those weeks he could have a big game.
Yeah, he can definitely have a big game. Now, if you look at it, if you just look at like fantasy points against or on paper, you think like, okay, this isn't a smash spot. Like the Steelers are not one of the worst defenses against the run. But you go back to that game, he only got 11 carries in that game, but he had 108 rushing yards. Meanwhile, Samaje Perine, who you just mentioned, who's not going to play this week, more than likely, with that high ankle sprain. Had another 7 carries for 31 yards. This has just opened the door for Chase Brown to become the absolute workhorse again. Kind of like what we saw last year, where he's playing 90+% of the snaps, getting all the touches here. But what I really love about this matchup for Chase Brown is he's probably going to get a ton of volume this week, because the Bengals and the Steelers are two of the fastest pace of play teams in the entire NFL. They snap the ball faster than almost every other team. When teams are both playing fast, then that leads to more snaps, more opportunities, and we have two bad defenses here going against, well, I mean, the Bengals offense is good. The Steelers offense has not looked good lately, but it doesn't matter because Vegas right now has this game at a 49.5 point total. That's the second highest of the entire slate here. Remember, last time they played, it was 33-31. And every Bengals game ends up being a shootout because this defense can't stop anybody. Remember, 2 weeks before the bye, they lost to the Jets because they couldn't stop the Jets offense the entire game. They're not, I don't care how bad the Steelers offenses look, they're not going to stop the Steelers offense. It's going to be a game where both teams are having to keep the foot on the gas the entire game. That's going to lead to plenty more opportunities for Chase Brown. And without Samaje Perine there, Taj Brooks isn't taking touches from him. He's going to be a monster this week.
All right, now a little less obvious. We have actually a couple of receivers we're going to get to here who are clearly the number one target on their team, but they haven't been number one receivers for fantasy necessarily. They've been good, not great. And so again, you're like, do I go all in on a guy like Jalen Waddle or not? Depends, right? That depends on the matchup. Well, I don't think it really depends anymore. Jalen Waddle has quietly been pretty dominant. He just hasn't had those monster games yet. In fact, I actually threw this out in reference to Luther Burden on the stash video, but throw up that stat again. Talk about since Tyreek Hill is out, Jacob Gibbs pointed out that with Hill just out of the picture completely, Jalen Waddle has basically been a monster here. He's one of the leaders in yards per route run. That's one of the most telling stats for a wide receiver. He's third only behind Puka Nacua and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Basically the two best receivers in all of fantasy this entire season. Another thing is Waddle hasn't put up the games like Puka or JSN, right? He just hasn't yet because he's on the Dolphins offense, right? Let's face it. It's a little bit limiting, but he's doing everything he can. He's put up basically elite numbers as far as he's able to. And, he has that super high floor. He's only been under 80 yards once. And unfortunately, he's only been over 100 yards once. But this might be time number 2.
Yeah, this certainly could be time number 2. Look, the Commanders' defense has really not been good all year, especially against the pass. But you look at it, like Marshawn Lattimore, okay, he was not playing his best football of the year here, but they've somehow gotten significantly worse since he tore his ACL. You look at it over the last 2 games. Now, granted, he didn't miss the entire game a couple weeks ago, but he missed most of that game. They are allowing the third most points to wide receivers lined up on the outside. They're also allowing the third most yards, the highest yards per target, and the most touchdowns to wide receivers lined up on the outside over the last 2 games. And yes, even though like Waddle early in his career was a slot guy, he's not that anymore. He plays on the outside almost 80% of his snaps. Plus, the Commanders play the 8th most single high, 55% of the time. This is the shell that, Tyreek Hill when he was healthy and Jalen Waddle dominate, right? The thing the team started to do against them was play a bunch of too high. But when they don't face that too high coverage, that's when we see these guys explode. This year, he ranks 5th among all wide receivers in fantasy points per route run and yards per route run versus single high. And he's 6th in targets per route run. And we've seen this defense the last 2 weeks get decimated by all sorts of wide receivers. Obviously, JSN a couple weeks ago, but don't forget, Torrey Horton scored twice. Cody White scored a touchdown. Last week, Jamison Williams looked like one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Amon-Ra had a monster game. Jalen Waddle is going to have a monster game this week against his Commanders defense. You have to have him locked into your lineups.
And then very similar to Jalen Waddle is Zay Flowers. We know he's the number 1 wideout in Baltimore, but what is that worth? This is still a team that runs the ball very well and spreads the ball out to some extent, and he's good, but he hasn't been great. But he especially lately hasn't had those big games. In fact, all season, 1 100-yard game, 1 receiving touchdown. The problem is those were both in the same game, and those were both in week 1. We haven't seen any boom, anything close to it at all from Zay Flowers. In fact, he hasn't even topped 75 yards since week 1. So you got to wonder, what's the upside here? I mean, again, he's solid, right? You never feel like you have to sit him or want him out of your lineup, but do you really feel compelled to put a guy like this who doesn't have that upside for a big game? You should, because again, Zay Flowers is doing his part. He's got that target share, right? I mean, by far on that team, he's the leading receiver for what it's worth. But also, come on, let's go back and remember, Lamar Jackson has missed half the season so far. He's back now, right? So there's that, but also the fact that Zay Flowers so far from weeks 1 up until 11 has had the second hardest adjusted strength of schedule to wide receivers. He's not had a lot of cupcake matchups here, and he's had to try to catch the ball from Cooper Rush several games. So look, he's doing his part. The separation is there. One thing I wonder though is because he gets the Cleveland Browns. Now Jalen Waddle, we thought he would boom against the Cleveland Browns a couple weeks ago, and that was his one down game in this last stretch. Why is Flowers going to be different?
Well, it's a good question. And we also thought Garrett Wilson would boom last week against the Browns, and he did the opposite of booming. But he's in the Jets offense. Remember, that game was in Cleveland. It was raining, and the Dolphins looked like they wanted to be anywhere but on a football field. But what I really love about this is the Browns are not a good defense against wide receivers against the pass. If you take out last week where, again, the Jets basically got two special teams touchdowns. They didn't have to throw the ball at all last week. The Browns are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers lined up out wide. Flowers, again, you think of Flowers, you think of slot guy, but no, he plays all over. He actually plays out wide over 60% of the time. They also play the 3rd most man and the 2nd most single high. These are coverages that Flowers absolutely dominates. You look at it on the season, he has run 60 routes against these two coverages. He has 18 targets on those routes, which is a very strong 0.3 targets per route run. He's caught 14 of those 18 targets for 191 yards, and that to the tune of 0.55 fantasy points per route run. Also, the Browns, they got Derrick Henry on the Ravens, but the Browns are 3rd toughest against the run. I don't think they're just going to be able to run the football against the Browns. This is a team you attack them through the air. Lamar is healthy. Zay's a great player. You talked about the fact that he had a tough schedule. I think it opens up. It starts this week. I think finally we're going to see him boom like we saw way back in week 1.
Now, if there's another rule you should follow when looking for these boom picks, it's chase those high-scoring games, particularly in games where you've got one team with a horrible defense. So let's go back to the well. Who else do you like in that Steelers-Bengals matchup?
Yeah, the other rule might just be start a running back against the Bengals. This might be too good to be true, but I don't care. It's too good to be true. It is. I got to have Jalen Warren as a boom this week. The Bengals aren't just allowing the most points to running backs right now. They're allowing almost 7 more fantasy points per game to running backs than any other defense. They are astronomically worse than anybody else. And you look at it since facing the Browns in week 1. Remember, that was the Browns without Quinshon Judkins. They have given up at least 105 rushing yards to every team they have faced. They've given up over 160 rushing yards in 4 games. And over the last 2 games combined, prior to the bye, they allowed 411 combined rushing yards to the Jets and the Bears, who did not have DeAndre Swift in that game. Plus, you look at Jalen Warren here, 72% of his runs are those zone runs, and he averages a full yard per carry more on those runs. Meanwhile, the Bengals are allowing the highest yards per carry, 5.7 on those runs, and the 2nd most touchdowns on those runs. And if that's all not enough for you, Jalen Warren has actually been good this year. He scored double-digit PPR points in all but 2 games this season, and that's despite only having 3 total touchdowns on the year. And he's quietly been a workhorse. This year he's played almost 60% of the snaps, he's handled 65% of the attempts, ran 34% of the routes, and he's expected to have 13.9 fantasy points per game for usage goes. So he's been an absolute workhorse. Plus, you look at it since the team's bye, he's handled every single inside the 5 carry. So he has touchdown upside. And the last time these 2 teams played, he scored 19.8 PPR points without a touchdown. I think he finds the end zone this week. But even if he doesn't, his floor alone might be enough for him to boom in this matchup.
Well, as tempted as I am to go to Pat Freiermuth in that matchup, again, no tight ends allowed. I'm not going there again. Well, let's go back to another wide receiver 2 type who's been good, but a lot of people are like, well, he's not great anymore, right? George Pickens, since CeeDee Lamb returned, of course, he's not the number one guy there. Not having those monster games. If you're in your typical 12-man league, you're like, yeah, I'll put him in there. I know he's going to do pretty well, but you're just not feeling a breakout game or anything like that. And if you're in those more shallow leagues, maybe you just have a stacked wide receiver room, you might wonder, well, do I start him or do I not? You want to do it this week. First of all, here's the thing. So Pickens hasn't had those ridiculously big games like he had a couple times when CD was out, but he's probably been better than you realize. The thing is, he hadn't been scoring touchdowns the last couple of weeks, and that's always the big difference maker. It's not like he's not getting targeted at all in the red zone. Like he is, just hasn't happened, right? He hasn't cashed in. But he's given you that floor even since CeeDee Lamb has come back. The last 3 games, Pickens has not gone under 78 yards receiving. He hasn't gone under double digits PPR points. So, of course, the floor is still always going to be there in this Dallas offense. He's been really good, though. He's been very efficient with the targets he's getting. He's 8th in terms of yards per target on the season. And so you want those targets, right, to be there. CeeDee Lamb obviously affects him, but this is a week where we could see him get even more because of the matchup. Now, he gets the Raiders. Now, we say the Raiders are typically more of a pass funnel defense. This is true. Didn't help a whole lot last week because Denver's offense is just that bad these days. And Troy Franklin, the number 2 receiver there, he still had a pretty decent game, at least for fantasy. I mean, come on. This Dallas offense, CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens, I think we're going to see a lot more points scored than we did last week when the Raiders were on the field. And the Raiders now have taken the lead in terms of being the most zone-heavy defense out of all. It just so happens George Pickens loves him some zone defenses. He averages 2.18 yards per route run against zone. That is a healthy number. That is top 25 overall among all wide receivers. He's going to get a good amount of targets. He has nobody that he should be scared of on the other side there defensively. And look, if he finds the end zone, those good games he's been having might turn into a great game, especially coming off their bye. All right, get those guys into your lineup if you can. And also don't forget, every other position, you want to know who should be in and out of your lineup. You got start sit advice at every position. As always, here's everything you need to know to win in week 11.